You can walk into almost any modern celebration and find alcohol somewhere nearby. A wedding, a birthday, a dinner, a party. Humans have spent thousands of years finding reasons to raise a cup and say, "Cheers." But here's the strange part. When did humans actually start drinking alcohol? The answer goes much farther back than you might expect. Long before anyone invented beer, wine bottles, or the concept of just one more, humans were already living around a substance that could make fermented food and drinks slightly more interesting. And the first alcohol may not have been invented at all. It may have been discovered. Because fermentation is not something humans created. Nature was doing it first. Leave fruit sitting around long enough, and naturally occurring yeast can begin converting its sugars into alcohol. Grapes can ferment. Berries can ferment. Honey mixed with water can ferment. Even grains can eventually become part of the process. So, imagine you're an early human. You find some fruit. It's sweet. You eat it. A few days later, you find more fruit from the same area. It smells different. Maybe it's softer. Maybe it tastes strange. And then you notice something else. It makes you feel different. You don't need a laboratory to understand that something happened. You just need curiosity. And humans have never been particularly short on curiosity. The problem is that we don't have a prehistoric diary saying, "Day 14, discovered fermented fruit. Felt weird. Would recommend." So, how do we know when humans started drinking alcohol? Archaeologists have to look for clues. And one of the biggest clues comes from ancient pottery. Because if humans were deliberately making alcoholic drinks, they needed somewhere to store them. And this is where the story gets surprisingly old. One of the earliest strong pieces of evidence for intentional alcohol production comes from a site called Rakefet Cave in what is now Israel. Researchers studying the site found evidence that ancient people associated with an Ethiopian culture were brewing a fermented beverage from grains around 13,000 years ago. Yes, around 13,000 years ago. Before cities, before writing, before supermarkets, before anyone could complain that their favorite beer had been discontinued, humans were apparently already making booze. The evidence is especially interesting because the Natufians were hunter-gatherers. You might imagine alcohol becoming important only after humans settled down, started farming, and had enormous amounts of grain sitting around. But the evidence from Rakefet Cave suggests something more complicated. These people were already experimenting with fermentation before full-scale agriculture had completely transformed human life. Researchers found stone mortars and chemical evidence consistent with ancient brewing activities. The drink was probably not exactly like modern beer. It was likely a fermented grain beverage, possibly thick and porridge-like. So don't imagine an ancient human cracking open a cold can. Think more like fermented cereal with a surprisingly powerful personality. And this raises a fascinating question. Why would hunter-gatherers bother making it? One possibility is that alcohol wasn't primarily about getting drunk. It may have been connected to ritual gatherings and ceremonies. Rakefet Cave was also used as a burial site, and researchers have suggested that the fermented drink may have been part of feasting and funerary rituals. In other words, alcohol may have become socially important because humans were gathering together, remembering the dead, celebrating, mourning, eating, and drinking, which tells you something important. Alcohol may have been tied to human social behavior almost from the beginning. But then something enormous happened. Humans started farming. And farming changed everything. Once people began cultivating crops such as wheat and barley, they suddenly had reliable sources of carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are extremely useful if you're trying to make fermented drinks. Grain contains starch. Starch can be converted into sugars. Yeast can consume those sugars. And yeast produces alcohol. Congratulations. You've accidentally built a brewery. Of course, humans didn't understand yeast chemistry. They didn't know about microorganisms. They just learned what worked. Grind this. Soak that. Leave it alone. Try again. And if the result made everyone at the gathering happier, congratulations, you had discovered a recipe. Some of the earliest civilizations appear to have taken this very seriously. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer became an important part of everyday life. And when I say beer, don't picture your modern lager. Ancient beer could be thick, cloudy, and very different from what you'd find in a supermarket today. But it was still fermented, and it was widespread. There is evidence from ancient Mesopotamia showing that beer was produced, distributed, and consumed on a large scale. In fact, beer became so important that it appears in some of the earliest written records we have. That's a fascinating coincidence. Humanity develops writing, and almost immediately, humans start writing about beer. Not exactly a glowing review of our priorities, but there was a practical reason for this. Beer wasn't just something people drank for fun. It could be part of food systems, labor systems, trade, and daily life. Workers could receive beer as part of their rations. People could drink it during meals. Temples could produce it, and governments could organize its distribution. So, alcohol wasn't sitting on the edge of civilization. It was becoming part of civilization itself. And then there's wine. Wine has an equally ancient story. One of the earliest known pieces of archaeological evidence for deliberate grape wine production comes from the site of Haji Fira's Teep in what is now Iran, dating to roughly 7,000 years ago. Archaeologists found large clay vessels containing residues consistent with ancient wine. Again, this wasn't a bottle of wine waiting neatly on a shelf. It was stored in large jars. And the people who made it were already dealing with one of the great problems of winemaking. Wine wants to become something else. Fermentation doesn't politely stop because you've reached your preferred alcohol level. So ancient people had to learn how to manage the process. They learned through observation. They learned through repetition. They learned because somebody made a batch that tasted terrible and somebody else made one that tasted considerably better. And eventually, alcohol became part of cultures across huge parts of the ancient world. Egyptians made beer and wine. Greeks developed elaborate wine cultures. Romans expanded viticulture across their empire. And alcohol became intertwined with religion, medicine, trade, hospitality, celebration, and social status. But here's the part that's easy to miss. Humans didn't simply discover alcohol and immediately decide to drink it every day. Different societies had very different relationships with it. Some treated particular alcoholic drinks as sacred. Some associated them with festivals. Some restricted who could drink. Some viewed drunkenness negatively. Some used alcohol in medicine or rituals. And some simply enjoyed getting a little less concerned about tomorrow. The important point is that alcohol became more than chemistry. It became culture. And that's probably why humans have kept making it for thousands of years. Because if alcohol were only about its chemical effects, its history might look very different. Instead, it's attached itself to human social life. You don't just drink wine. You drink it at dinner. You don't just drink beer. You drink it with friends. You don't just raise a glass. You make a toast. And that ritual is incredibly old. Humans are social animals. We gather. We celebrate. We mourn. We negotiate. We form alliances. We mark important moments. And alcohol has repeatedly found its way into those moments. But there is another possibility that's even more interesting. Some researchers have suggested that fermented foods and drinks may have been attractive to humans partly because our ancestors were already capable of detecting and consuming naturally fermented foods. There is even a hypothesis, sometimes called the drunken monkey hypothesis, which proposes that our primate ancestors may have encountered alcohol naturally in ripe, fermenting fruit. The idea is intriguing, but don't take it too far. It doesn't mean your distant ancestors were swinging through trees looking for happy hour fruit. The evidence doesn't prove that humans evolved specifically to drink alcohol. It simply points toward a world where fermentation existed naturally long before humans learned to control it. And that distinction matters. Because alcohol isn't an invention like a wheel. The chemical process was already happening. Humans learned how to harness it. And once humans learned how, they became remarkably creative. They fermented grains. They fermented grapes. They fermented honey. They developed different recipes. They stored drinks in different containers. They figured out how to transport them. They created traditions around them. And eventually, they built entire industries around something that started with microscopic organisms eating sugar. Think about how ridiculous that chain of events is. A yeast cell consumes sugar. It produces alcohol. A human notices. Thousands of years later, you are standing in a supermarket comparing 12 kinds of beer. Civilization is strange, but there's one more twist. Alcohol may actually be older than agriculture. If the evidence from Reykjavik Cave is correct, humans were brewing a fermented grain drink around 13,000 years ago, before farming became dominant. That means alcohol wasn't necessarily a consequence of civilization. It may have been one of the things humans were experimenting with while civilization was beginning to form. And that changes the way you think about ancient humans. They weren't simply struggling to survive every minute of every day. They were also gathering, celebrating, experimenting, making food more interesting, creating rituals, and finding ways to alter their experience of the world. That's a very human thing to do. The first alcoholic drink probably wasn't perfect. It probably wasn't clear. It probably didn't come with a fancy label. It may not even have tasted particularly good, but somebody tried it. Then somebody tried making it again. And somebody else thought, we should probably make more of this. And that tiny decision eventually leads all the way to the modern world. From fermented grain in an ancient cave, to Mesopotamian beer, to Egyptian breweries, to Greek wine, to Roman vineyards, to every modern bar, restaurant, celebration, and kitchen where humans still gather around fermented drinks. So, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? The best answer is at least around 13,000 years ago, based on archaeological evidence for deliberate brewing at Reykjavik Cave. But the real story probably starts even earlier, because fermentation existed before us. Humans didn't invent alcohol. We discovered what nature had already been doing. Then we spent thousands of years figuring out how to control it. And maybe that's the most interesting thing about the whole story. Humans have always looked at the world around them and thought, that's interesting. What happens if I change it? Can I make it better? And occasionally, can I drink it? So next time you see a glass being raised at a celebration, remember that you're looking at a ritual with an extraordinarily long history. Not because humans have always needed alcohol, but because humans have always searched for ways to gather, celebrate, experiment, and change ordinary moments into memorable ones. Look at what you're consuming. Question where it came from. Remember how long humans have been experimenting. You're not just holding a drink. You're holding one tiny chapter of humanity's very long experiment with fermentation.